Sorry. Looping is fun, especially if you know where you are. That is why with Laravel 5.3 we got this new loop variable available in our loops. And with this variable, we can always know where in this loop we are. So let's have a look at it together. And sneak peek, at least at some of the ideas I have, or some of that are more than ideas, for the near future of this course. But that's not what I actually wanted to talk about. I want to talk about the new loop variable introduced in Laravel 5.3. That's the variable I'm talking about, and well, what is it about? As the name implies, you can use it inside loops. Here I do have a loop. Actually, I do have two loops, the outer loop and the inner loop here. And I'm just feeding some data to this view here. The data I feed is basically, well, an array, which is kind of hard to read because I structured it really greatly here. But that's just an array with some items and an array inside of the array. So like this, that's an extra array inside of the array. So I have a nested array, and in my view, I simply have an outer loop, and then I check if the item is an array, so this nested array, in which case I create another loop, otherwise I output the item right away. So far, so simple. Now what's this loop variable doing? Well, this loop variable gives us access to some nice utility variables or features we can use inside of the loop. For example, here I'm finding out which the current iteration is. So what's the number of the current iteration? The iteration starts at 1, so not at 0. It's not the index, it's the iteration. And I check if the iteration is 2, then I want to give this item a class of highlighted because 2 happens to be the loop item here in the array, which I want to highlight because that's this lecture. Now, besides iteration, which can be useful to find out where you're at in this loop, we also got index, which is almost the same but starts at 0. So here I would have to change this to 1 to achieve the same effect, as you can see. Well, there are a couple of other useful properties on this loop object. For example, we got remaining. Now I'll simply output this in the end of the div here and separate it with simply a dash. And here I'll output loop remaining. And I'll simply copy this to my other div here too to see it in all cases. Now what would you guess to do, or what would you guess that this does? Let's have a look. It prints us the remaining iterations. So here we have 3 remaining iterations at the beginning of the list, then 2. Then in the nested loop we have 6 remaining, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0 we're done, and 0 we're done with the outer loop. So you already see the loop object always refers to the for each loop it's in, so to the inner or the outer for each loop. We got 2 distinct loop objects here, which is of course great because this allows us to be much more flexible regarding the information we're retrieving. Besides remaining, and I'll just edit them both at a time, I also got count. Now what could count be? Let's have a look. Count is simply the number of items or of iterations in the loop. So we got 4 items here in the array. Well, let's have a look if this is true. We got this 1, 2, then the array 3, and then 4. And in the array we got 7, which is why we here see 7. So count is not changing. It always refers to the total amount of items in the array. But that can be useful if you want to have some if-else check in your loop, checking if you're near the end, for example, if you're over half the items in the array or something like that. That is where count could be really helpful. Let's have a look at the next possible or the next property we can retrieve. That would be first. Now what does first do? Let's see it in action. Okay, it prints 1 and 1. So do you see what it does? It actually returns as true or false if we are at the first iteration. So we are at the first iteration of the outer loop here and on the first iteration of the inner loop here. Therefore, we don't see any output in all the other cases. Now, when could first be useful? Well, basically, first and last, which you'll also see that we have, are very useful properties as you oftentimes want to do something special right before starting or at the first iteration or right after finishing. Or you want to find out, is this the last iteration? really that is a useful feature. And with first, and well, I already mentioned it, of course we also got last, we got very useful utility features here. So last will of course mark the last iterations. And again, keep in mind, we do have two distinct loop objects for the inner and the outer loop. Now, what if I wanted to access the outer loop from my inner loop? So I want to have access to the outer loop object in my inner loop. Well, I can use the loop, here I am, loop parent property, which gives me access to the outer loop object. So on this parent, I could then also access count, for example. So all the properties we just saw. So if I do this, well, now we got 4, 4, 4, 4, even though the count of the inner loop would be 7, as you saw before, but now we're referring to the outer loop. So we have this possibility of referring to the outer loop variable, and we're not sticking, or we don't have to stick to the one of our inner loop here. The final property we have related to this is the def property. So I'll add the def property to, whoops, without parent though, to both the inner and the outer loop object. And let's see what this does. If I refresh, we see 1, 1, and then 2 in the inner loop. This basically gives us the depth of where this loop object is in. For the outer loop, it's the, well, outest most or the most highest loop object we could have. It's in the outer loop, so we have 1. But then it's nested one level in the inner loop, which is why we have 2 here. If we would have another nested loop, well, we would have 3 and so on. So that can be useful to dynamically determine where you are at in your code or in which level of looping you are at. So that's the loop object with all the properties just discussed. Definitely play around with it. In the video description, you not only find that code, but also a link to the official description which lists all these properties. See you in the other videos. Bye.